All right. So API basically stands for Application Programming Interface. Now, in the context of APIs, what does application actually mean? Right? It's essentially a software or some distinct kind of function or service. And the interface piece in the application programming interface actually refers to a contract between two applications who are trying to communicate with each other. So that's kind of the best way I feel to describe an API, and all credit to Amazon for defining it this way. So today we're actually specifically interested in public APIs. Now, what other kind of APIs exist, right? So since we said it's an interface, you could have interface between services in your product that you've built, which are not exposed to the outside. It's just a contract. It's something that services internally talk to each other with, but nobody else outside of, let's say, your company building the product actually has access to it. Now, those APIs are not super useful to people outside of the company trying to build something with it, right? And so the class of APIs that are actually exposed to customers and to people in general, to the public, are called public APIs. So now, what does open for everyone to access mean? Does it mean free? Not necessarily, right? So there are public APIs which are charged, and one example is the OpenAI API, which recently got released. And they could be free as well, right? So the YouTube transcribe API, which we're going to really quickly come to in our project, is a free API, right? Now, even if they're free, they might actually have mechanisms called authentication token. What does that mean? Now, typically when you use a product, you log into it. You have a username and a password, right? And the reason you have a username and password is you want to protect whatever you're doing on that platform. You want to protect whatever you're storing on the platform potentially. And so tokens are an analogous mechanism to that. And to be able to use this API or service, you might need a token. So an example of that is going to be DevRev APIs. We're going to quickly come to that as well. All right, so you can click on these links to go to the specific APIs and check them out. Because they're public, you will actually be able to see the contents and appreciate what we're talking about. Now, we always talk about why do we need to learn about APIs and what can we do with them, right? So the best way to think of an API is this visualization. I know most people would have done Legos over here. This is what I spent last year's December doing, building this Eiffel Tower with my husband. So the Lego pieces that you use to kind of build these structures are like the APIs. So they're actually these small blocks that you can chain together and make something out of it, right? And the actual built piece is like the product. So just something to explain what APIs are and why they're so critically important. Now, what can you do with these APIs? There are a few different things. We said they're interfaces to products and services. So we can actually integrate multiple services and products. Now, they could be products and services which don't actually have any relation to each other. They could be two separate companies building something completely different, but you might be able to see a use case that needs parts of one service and parts of another, and you try to build an integration. You could use it to extend the platform's functionality. So let's say that you are trying to build something on the iPhone app, for example, would be a good example of extending platform functionality. But you could do this very well with any platform that offers you an API to use as a foundation and then to build on top of it. The third advantage is, let's say you have like a idea and you want to just act on it super quickly. You can do that because you'll have a stable API which actually exposes out a foundation which is strong, right? So given these three things, it's a great way to get hobby projects started, and you can contribute it to the open source community. That's a great way to collaborate, and that's also a great way to build your resume. Okay, moving on quickly to the question of how do we actually discover these APIs? Every product or service that actually exposes the API, usually it has some documentation that goes with it. And some of them actually follow standards, which make it easy to find tooling around. And I'll explain this in a bit. We look at an example of how that works. But for developer docs, Google product APIs have great developer documentation to read. So it has it has all of the Google products in one place. So you can find Gmail APIs, Drive APIs, etc. And it's a good place to play around. DevRev, which we're also going to talk about in a little bit more detail, complies to a specification. So when it publishes a specification, it's easy to use that standard and use any tool that's built for the standard to visualize what those APIs are. I'll give you an example in a second. I also want to quickly talk about the distinction between public and beta, right? So a public API is essentially, like we said, available to the public, but it also comes with certain version guarantees. What do I mean by that, right? So let's say I asked you to start building an application using DevRev's APIs. And you started building it, you've got everything figured out, you're going to release your application. And at that point, I say, hey, you know what? I changed my mind. I don't want this interface to look like this. I want to change the variable name. I want to change it in such a way that your application is actually going to break. But you know what? I'm just going to make the change. I can't usually do that with a public API, or at least that's usually not a good practice, because you have to actually declare a version that you support for a public API. And if you make a change which is going to break someone's application, you release it as a new version. And the person who's built the application will now decide, do I want to move to the new version, make changes in my application, or do I want to just stay on the old one and live without the new features that you're offering me, right? Now with beta APIs, the contract is a little different. Beta actually means that it's work in progress. It's like, I am working on this API interface, but I'm telling you, I'm signaling to you ahead of time that it's likely to change. That because I haven't decided that this is optimal, I might actually change my mind. So when you adopt a beta API to build your product, you should kind of watch out for the fact that it might change and you might need to make changes to your product or your application that you're building. Okay, so now coming back to the standard that we spoke about, we said that there's something called an OpenAPI spec, which DevRev complies to. What is it, right? Now, this is a language agnostic interface for HTTP APIs, which allows the humans and computers to discover and understand capabilities of a service without actually looking at documentation or source code. What do we mean by this? Now, if you actually have a particular syntax or a description detailing how you need to interpret some piece of logic, and in this diagram, you can basically see you have something called components, you have responses, there is some kind of styling and semantics in place over here. So because it's a fixed structure and there are rules to it, you can actually build tools around it to interpret what is written in your definition or in your specification, right? Because you know the rules of the game, and so therefore you can render it. The advantage of having a specification like this for your API is, one, it's standard. It helps you express the different features in your API very clearly. And it also allows the person who is trying to understand your API to use whatever tools they feel like and see what your API does. And this is one such tool, by the way. The slides will be shared, so I do encourage you to click on this and try it. This is a Swagger editor, which is free for everyone to try. And we're going to watch a really quick description, a really quick video about this. right? So what are we doing over here? This is the Swagger editor, which I said you could try. What you would need to do is import a file. Now you would import any OpenAPI spec file. In my case, I imported the devrev spec file, which you are going to have access to as well through the open source repo that I'm going to briefly share. And then you can see all of these different things, right? You can see what is a GET request, what is a POST request. You can actually see what are the different parameters, what is the type of each parameter, and you can even try it out. So it's a great way to play around with APIs and to understand what's there. And so that's the link. And the try it on the previous slide actually takes you to this page and you can play around with it. Now let's go to how do you use this to actually build projects, which is like the crux of what we wanted to talk about, right? So let's break it down into a bunch of steps. You obviously want to have a high-level problem statement or an idea that you want to work on or you want to solve, right? And then you want to break that idea down into smaller blocks that are actionable. And then you want to identify APIs which can actually help you solve every block of it, right? And then you want to actually find documentation for those APIs, because now you've come to the point of, hey, I need the details of how this specific set of APIs work so that I can write code against it. And then the last step is, of course, you actually build it. You use those APIs and you build some logic around it, and you code it up. What we are going to do is we're going to take a deeper look into every step of this with a specific example. And the final code that we write is actually in an open source Git repository that I have shared with everyone. So you will have access to the code. And we will also see a demo of what that code produces. So let's identify a high-level problem statement. Now, how do we do this, right? Personally, I feel it is best to pick a problem that is personal to you. What I mean by that is, let's say there is something that you feel is suboptimal in anything that you've been doing, and you want to fix it. You're like, hey, I wish this was the problem. This was the case, right? I wish somebody had solved this. And then you're like, hey, why can't that be me? So one such example for me personally is the today I learned. What do I mean by that? Every day we consume a ton of content, right? I think I speak for the entire group over here when I say that, but I'm sure we watch a lot of videos. We're trying to learn concepts. We might be learning small snippets of concepts, or we might be deep diving into concepts, but we're constantly actually consuming content. And especially in the form of YouTube videos, which could be from various sources. The thing with YouTube videos for me is it's great when I'm listening to the video. I feel like I get it. Yeah, this makes total sense, right? But unfortunately, I'm not able to write and summarize and maintain clearly what the gist of that video is. And also, maybe I remember it for a week, but a couple of weeks later, my recall of the video and the details is kind of very blurred, right? So that's one problem that I have. The other problem I have is being able to communicate this to my team, right? Because usually when you are trying to research things, it's highly likely that you're doing this in the context of something you're building as a team, right? And in our context, this team could actually be just the Women Who Code group over here, right? Now, we want to be able to easily share with each other what we've learned. But I don't necessarily want to, if I just sent you a video link, that would mean that you have to spend another 30 minutes or 20 minutes listening to the entire video. And we all know that everyone's short of time and you're probably not going to actually go and listen to that video, right? So this is the problem that's been plaguing me, and I felt I should solve it. So now how do I solve this? Let's break down the problem into blocks. What does that mean? So I told you a bunch of different things, right? But in all the long sentences that I said, the crux of the problem was, hey, I can't remember everything that I watch, and I find it hard to rewatch things because I don't have enough time. That was one problem. Second problem was I can't share what I learn easily with my team, and I cannot index information. In the sense, it's not easily categorized, searchable for me. So let's see how to solve the first one. I can't remember what I watch. All right. Maybe it'll be easier for me to look up text. Maybe if somebody jotted down really detailed notes about the video and then stored it in a way that I can easily find it, then that would be useful to me, right? So what I'm looking for is I want to first convert video into text. Obviously, I don't have a person that I can employ to, go watch the video and write down text for me. But we do have APIs that can transcribe video for us, right? And I'm looking for something specific. Like I know that it's YouTube videos that I watch. So YouTube is probably where I should look to see if they might offer something that can transcribe video into text. What about the second part? How do I share it with my team, right? What am I looking for? I basically want to store specific notes. That's whatever we transcribed in the previous step. And I want to make it topic specific, right? So if I'm going to learn about, let's say, ChatGPT and security, I don't want them all in one basket because then it's very hard for me to figure out what I learned from in each of these areas, right? And also, I want it to be discoverable in the sense that maybe some members of my team are interested in security. I want them to easily find my notes on security. And I want to do this, most of all, with minimum effort, right? So I don't want to be going and copying and pasting and putting things in, none of that, right? The last point is I want a limited audience. I mean, I just want people in my team to have access to this. So what's the platform that will give me all of this? I am going to guess that most of the audience today probably has not heard of DevRev. So I will give a brief introduction of what DevRev as a platform does. Basically, DevRev is a system which is best described as a co-pilot for building products, supporting them, for marketing them. So all aspects of product building. What is a co-pilot? I'm kind of now assuming that everyone over here has heard of GitHub Copilot. It's basically used as an aid for programming, right? It auto-completes your programming. Sometimes you write comments and then it auto-completes the syntax. What it's doing is just simplifying your life, right? It's automating whatever it can for you so that it gets out of your way and lets you focus on the important things. So that at a high level is what DevRev does. But very specifically, why do I think it's going to solve my problem of writing specific notes which are discoverable, minimum effort, limited audience? Okay, so let's break this long sentence again down into specifics. What do I need? Okay, so I said topics. So I need to categorize my today I learned notes into different topics. Fine. So I need a mechanism to do it. Okay. Then I need to be able to easily update all my learnings in some kind of a log or a journal that I can look back on. Right. And then I want to find my team's learnings as well on the topic. So I want this based on a topic. And anybody who learned anything, I should be able to look at their log as well. And then, of course, like we said, limited audience. So we want to know who actually is getting access to this information, because I don't want to be worried about, hey, am I putting something out there which could be misused? So let's look at the next step. How do we identify the required APIs for all those steps that we pointed out? we said YouTube first. All right. YouTube actually published this API, the transcript API, and it actually has something in PyPy that we can look up. But when you go to this website, you'll basically notice that it has a bunch of different APIs. So you now have access to all of these APIs. And I do recommend that everybody go check out this link because it actually explains in detail how each of these APIs can be used and so on. But you have to now pick the API that you care about. What was our problem statement? We just have to transcribe videos into text. For my problem statement, I only worried about text in English. And I'm also just wanting it to be formatted as text. So based on those two, I wouldn't want to go with an API which is able to output multiple languages. I don't want to like fetch all of the transcripts. Like if you can support 20 languages, give me everything. I don't want any of that because I have a very specific use case, which is I want it in English. So I'm going to go with the simplest API that gets me the English translation. And then I also need something to format it. Okay, I'm in luck. They actually have a formatter, which I can use as well. Okay, so now we're done identifying what we need to transcribe YouTube videos into English text. We do notice that there is an input over here which is required, which is the video ID, which is very easy to get. Anyone who's actually watching a video ID, in the URL, you'll basically see the end of the URL actually has the ID, which is the video ID. We'll quickly see a demo as well. So we have all the information to use this API. Let's go to the next one, DevRev. Before we jump into the APIs, because there's so many different APIs to consider, given that we wanted to do way more with the DevRev APIs compared to what we wanted with the YouTube API, which was very specific. So we need to understand the product a little bit more before we can dive into the specific APIs. I do at this point request anybody who's interested to put down their email IDs in chat if you're comfortable, or if you prefer, please email them to ashwini.wwcode@gmail.com, and I will get you access to this platform. Katya, who is on the line, can help as well. So please put your email IDs in the chat, and Katya, please help with adding them on our platform so they have access. Now, once you have access, what you will be able to do is you'll be able to log in to this platform, which basically means it's restricted. You have a token and you have been specifically allowed to be added to the platform. So it isn't like a free for all. And once you're added, I recommend that you go and check out this thing called Trails. What is Trails? So Trails is basically a graphical representation of your product. How can we map this to our problem statement? What are we trying to do? We want learning logs, right? And at a very high level, what are we trying to do? We're trying to innovate with APIs. That's our product. Let's say the capability right now that we're focused on is using learning logs. And then we said we wanted categories. So we want to have like a bunch of different categories. So you can actually have security, chat GPT, building with APIs, bunch of these things, right? And we basically also want with each of these categories to associate each person's logs. Okay, looks like I have a way to do that. You can see Ashwini's TIL log, which is basically kind of linked to one of these categories. And the next step, I'm also able to post to this log. Okay, that doesn't sound too bad. I can give you the actual link of the video and you see the transcription below that. So looks like this platform can offer what we want to do. There's a way to do it with the platform. So now what do? The next step is actually finding the APIs. How do we find the APIs? Again, let's break it down into each of the pieces that we're interested in. We said, first thing, find the category. If you looked at the previous slide, you'll notice our vocabulary of category in our problem statement matches to what DevRev calls the feature. So sure, we should be able to find an API to get the features. And then we want a way to automatically store the transcribed notes. Automatic being that you write the program to do it, of course, but you need a way to store it. And that's the API, right? And going back to our example, we have something called a work item or an issue. And then we have this, which is like a comment or a post on that work item. So you have two APIs to do that. That sounds good. Now, I also want a team member to be able to easily discover what I'm doing. And like I said, any of you, once you get access to the platform, every one of you would be able to go into these categories and check all the logs that are posted on it. So you'll be able to easily identify. And there is an API for that. Okay. So we have found a bunch of APIs. At a high level, we know what we're doing. What about the details, right? The devil's always in the details. So like we said, DevRev supports the OpenAPI spec, making life a little easier. So you should be able to get the spec file over here. I've linked it over here. It's in the repository. You'll find it in multiple places. And you should be able to take that and put it in the tool that I mentioned earlier, the Swagger tool, play around with it. But you also have an alternate mechanism that I want to introduce. It's called Postman. It's a very useful application to play around with. And we will briefly walk through it. So you will have something called a Postman collection, which is public. It is linked again in the slides. You'll find all of the DevRev APIs there. Now, the globals over here are essentially what are called the environment settings. So we said we needed a token, right? So the token is set as a global value, so every API can use it. And this token is specific to your use case. Now, we just called an API from Postman. We were able to get the response, right? Given that you have this collection available to you, the public API collection, you should be able to try this out. And on the right-hand side, you can see the corresponding code for this. I will caveat it though, that the code is very simplistic. So you may not be able to just copy and paste the Postman code and get your application done. And when you look at the open source repo, you'll understand why I'm saying you can't just copy paste things, right? But it gives you a very good sense, or it gives you pointers on the capabilities of the API and how you can use it. So I do recommend taking a look at our Postman collection. All right, so now we're ready to actually build it. So we have the APIs, we have the specific YouTube APIs, we have the specific DevRev APIs, we have examples on how to use it, and we have played around with it. We've logged into the system, so we have a token. So now let's go build. So there is an open source repo. I highly recommend that you take a look at the repo. We're going to walk through it real quick, but you should look through it. This is the repo shared with everybody, and you will basically see a structure here where it starts with a README, like some description of the problem, the setup, the usage. And now we go to the actual structure. So we go to the source code. There is something called not object-oriented. This is an example to tell you why, just to compare and contrast, right? Like I would like you to take a look at this code to compare it with the other code, and then tell me what you find as better, optimal, suboptimal, etc. Now going to this, which is the object-oriented code, which comes in a class, you will see every function has a linked URL pointing to the API specification that it is actually implementing. So it makes it easy to see how we're stitching things together. And this is the transcribe part. So transcribe is the YouTube transcribe is a separate class. DevRev is a separate class to keep them separate. And then you have this TIL function, which uses both the classes.
Ashwini,
and
sorry
which
to
we
interrupt.
together. Yeah.
They are saying to zoom a little bit. They're not able to see it.
Oh, I see. You're not able to see the. Sorry, are you not able to see the repo or?
Screen, basically. Just the GitHub screen. So yeah, they are not able to.
Is this any better?
Manjushri, if you can just type in the chat if it's okay. Yeah, she said it's okay.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Yeah. Sure. So this was kind of more of an overview of the structure, but I do recommend that you actually go into the repo and check it out. And that would give you like a better sense of the usage. All right. Now it's demo time. So we've identified the APIs. We've actually built some code with it. We've made it open source. So just a couple of words on making it open source. The good thing about open source is it allows you to collaborate with everyone. So I have put out some code. All of you can look at it. You can critique it. You can add to it. You can build on the existing foundation, make it much better. So something big could come out of an open source project. It also helps you gain credibility because since your project is open source, putting it on your resume tells the person who is trying to hire you exactly what your capabilities are in terms of coding. So it's a great way to establish credibility as well. Now let's get into the demo. So we said this is what we started with, right? So we went to Trails, we figured out the product capability feature. Now I have like a YouTube video that I'm watching and I want to say, okay, does it fit in any of these categories? Probably not. So let me add a new category. This is DALL-E 2 that I was trying to understand yesterday, right? So, okay, I'll add something on DALL-E 2 and then let's see, I need to probably give you a short description to just say, okay, let's put all the learnings on DALL-E 2 over here. And this will basically act as a placeholder for everybody to hang their issues, which are essentially TIL logs in our use case, on this particular hook on DALL-E 2. So we've created this. Once we've created it, you will see it visualized. So now you see DALL-E 2 is over there. And we now go, this is the open source repo. Now we have the code over here, right? And we said we have setup and usage. What's the first step? We need a token and we need to be able to export a token. Now, how do I get the token in the first place? You can actually follow that link over there. It gives you kind of some pictures and makes it easy to tell you how to get it. But essentially this demo gives it to you as well. Go to settings, go to an account, go to personal access token, create a new token with whatever validity you're comfortable with, give it a name, and then say generate it, right? So I'm going to generate a test. Just a caveat over here, ideally this token should not be shared with anybody. So for instance, since I'm sharing it with you all over a video, I have revoked these tokens and it won't work, right? So I recommend whenever you end up sharing it for whatever reason, please revoke the tokens. Now, export it. This is basically according to what we saw in the README. So now you've exported the token because your program is going to use that token. And then there's some instructions. I do want to say I recorded this last night and I ended up kind of revamping the code. So if you go to the actual open source repo now, you will see different instructions, but please follow whatever is in the open source repo at the moment. Now, I was watching this video, right, on DALL-E 2. I have to get that particular ID. So you can see over here that there is an ID and I run the script. Do look at the requirements.txt as well. That will tell you the environment that you need in terms of using Python 3, using request module and a bunch of these things. And yeah, and I want to hang this on ChatGPT because this was a ChatGPT video that I was listening to. Sure. So what happened now? I watched that video and I go back to Trails. I find ChatGPT and I say, okay, there's one issue over there. What's that? Oh, it's Ashwini's TIL log. Interesting. Let me go see what's there. Aha. So now I have a transcript of that YouTube video that I was actually watching. So that was one. Let's see if we can do another one. I mean, you never know. One might be a fluke, right? So let's try this one, which is basically on generative models. And I'm not actually changing the category, right? I'm saying this is also ChatGPT. So what happens at this point? You'll see it's the same issue that actually gets updated, right? So this was the one that we were looking at. If you go, you scroll, you'll actually see two. Please notice there's a date, right? And I personally find it useful to have a date because we know that technology evolves super fast and you want to make a distinction and prioritize things which are more recent compared to something that was probably published 10 years ago. So it's useful to add the date in. Now, DALL-E 2. So we're going to try DALL-E 2. So this was basically because we want to see, okay, so we now know we can keep posting to the same feature. What if I try a different feature? Okay, so I'm going to try this with DALL-E 2. And I see that there is a new issue at this point. That's because it is linked to DALL-E 2. That's the issue. And there's a TIL log, which is a transcript. All right. At this point, I know it's probably getting super repetitive and you're like, okay, are you going to actually keep doing videos after videos doing the same thing? But believe me, there's a point why I'm actually showing you this last one. This one is actually a recording of the Women Who Code group. This was on security. I was like, okay, the way this is different from the rest that we've tried is it's a much, much longer video. So I'm going to try this. What happened here? Okay, looks like DevRev actually has a post limit of 16 KB at a time. And this video is basically going over it. So what do? Well, I don't want to crash, so I just truncate it. So I'm basically limiting the transcript. So you'll see that nothing crazy happens, but it's just that it probably stopped mid-sentence because I cut it off at 16 KB and I'm like, no more. Not the most graceful handling, but it's intentionally left there so that I can ask for contributors to come and handle this better. So that was a simple project that we built, exercising DevRev APIs, exercising the YouTube APIs, and doing something useful that your team can actually look at and use. Of course, there are improvements. This is like the very first cut, right? So the first limitation is what I just showed you, the fact that anything larger than 16 KB, we just abruptly cut it off. There are a million ways to do this more gracefully. I would love to hear ideas from everyone. And I would also love contributions from anyone who would like to contribute. The other thing, and this is something that you will notice once you all are able to log into the system and able to look at the transcription a little closer and understand what it's doing, we need better transcription. And you will see this the moment you kind of look at the details. You'll see that some of the words are kind of stuck to each other. It's not perfect. So we should figure out a better way to transcribe. Also, let's actually explore the OpenAI APIs for summaries. Now, one of the main things we said in the problem statement was we don't actually have time and we want a crisp summary of what we learned. We don't necessarily want verbatim everything that was said in this video, right? And so summaries is something we can explore with OpenAI. Do note that it is a paid API, so we might have to tread with caution in terms of how many times you call the API and keep track of how much you spend on it and so on. These are just some things top of my head, but I am very happy to brainstorm ideas. Please reach me on my email or on LinkedIn. And also, please do share your email IDs for access. This is the call to action, essentially. Please send me an email to get access to the DevRev platform if you haven't already shared it on the chat. All right, at this point, I will pause for questions.
Ashwini, there were multiple questions being asked during the presentation, so I'll start from the beginning.
Perfect.
So there was Elizabeth. The first question from her was is the input file for Swagger a JSON file?
Is the input file? Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So they actually accept JSON as well as YAML. For tools, there are lots of tooling that you can find if you Google OpenAPI spec tools. And if you do find a tool which only accepts JSON, there are YAML to JSON converters, which are also available for free that you can use. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, she said it, so it's means yeah, she got it. So the next question she asked that the date of the video being published or the date of the video was viewed, so in the YouTube video. So yeah,
that's another great question. This is the date that it was published. More to kind of keep track of. I kind of assume that if we are watching a particular video, we're making a conscious choice to watch it, right? So there are, I'll tell you the distinction. So if I am watching something to understand how, let's say, electrons actually orbit, right? There might not have been much change in that area in the fundamentals, right? Like I'm watching a fundamental physics video, for example. And so then even if the video was posted, let's say 5 or 10 years ago, it's still relevant to me. So I'm watching it that day. But then once I watch it that day, I'm actually recording the date I watched it, because let's say that I watched it that day and then I jot down my learnings. And then probably like a year or 2 years later, I watch something else and then I've like posted it with that date. It just helps me look at, oh, okay, fine. Like maybe I haven't looked at anything in a year. Maybe what I looked at more recently is actually more relevant, just to make that distinction. But kind of happy to hear ideas about whether you want the date to be something different. Yeah, happy to brainstorm that.
These were the most questions from the chat. So yeah, if anybody has questions, just raise your hands and Ashwini or I will unmute you so you can answer. You can ask the questions.